It's the week ending Friday the 27th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Israeli strikes displacing thousands of people in Lebanon and Hezbollah firing a missile at Tel Aviv. The Prime Minister promising there's light at the end of the tunnel in his speech at the Labour Party conference, and Finland returning 2 giant pandas to China because they're too expensive to keep. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is the boss man Holden Frith. We welcome back writer and performer Chandrika Chakrabarti, and today marks the auspicious debut of Vincent Moss, former political editor of the Sunday Mirror. Hi, Vincent.
Hi, hello.
Now, Vincent, tradition dictates that as it is your first time on the show, you must now declare to us all a fact about yourself, which we could not have discovered merely by Googling you.
Right. My fact is I once returned the former Prime Minister David Cameron's stolen bicycle, which he had stolen outside a Tesco's in Notting Hill. And we, when I was on a newspaper, tracked down his bicycle and gave it back to him, much to his complete surprise, and to ours too.
Wow, that makes you a hero, I think. Maybe
I think
qualified
so.
for social housing now too.
Possibly, although there was a sort of a postscript that went rather wrong, which is the front wheel had been nicked, so we replaced the front wheel. It later came off, and he accused us of trying to kill him. Jokingly, I hope, though.
Have you ever had a bike stolen, Holden? You strike me as a cyclist.
I haven't had a whole bike stolen, but I have had various parts of one, including the saddle, which did make it difficult to ride.
And Chandrika, I don't know why, but you just strike me as a walker.
I am more of a walker because I've had bikes stolen so many times.
There you go, it's the experience. You need Vincent on hand to return anything that
I'll
goes
come
missing.
and find them. Let me know.
Vincent, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Thanks, Ollie. I think it should be remembered for how tech is now becoming the new frontier in warfare, but maybe Sweden hasn't quite got the message.
The aim was to create division in Swedish society. The words of Swedish prosecutors on Tuesday as they accused Iran's intelligence service of hacking a phone operator last year to send some 15,000 messages encouraging people to take revenge on protesters who had burned the Quran. Violent riots broke out in Sweden last year after several anti-Islam activists set fire to copies of the Islam...
Selina Sykes reporting for France 24 on Tuesday. Vincent, what's the story?
Well, this week, Swedish prosecutors have been talking a lot more about something that happened in Sweden last year, which was this sort of fascinating case about how Iran effectively hacked into the SMS messages of about 15,000 Swedes and sent messages out saying that following the book burning of the Quran, their holy book last year, that people should take revenge in Sweden. So it's very much attempting to sow the seeds of division and create the impression that Sweden was an Islamophobic country by sending out all of these text messages.
And these were messages that were sent on a commercial phone operator?
Yeah, essentially what had happened is, according to the Swedish security services, they'd hacked into a phone operating system, and a cyber group called Anzu, who believed to be acting for Iran's Revolutionary Guards, had hacked into this system, managed to send out these messages, and finally these Swedish prosecutors this week have sort of spoken about it and tracked down them. They don't think they'll ever be able to bring this Anzu group to justice, but it's just fascinating how they've got into these phones and essentially sent a message to all these private individuals in Sweden saying those who insulted the Quran must be punished for their work. So obviously a very sort of dangerous precedent, and something that if other terror groups can do it, I mean, who knows where it could end.
Well, except, Holden, in this case, it's actually not malware, is it, as I understand it? You know, when we talk about, as Vincent just said, getting into phones, this is an idea. This is propaganda. This is a text message saying this is what we think you should think about this. I mean, it can be, I suppose, just as dangerous, but it's not the same as something that's taking over their phone or something like that. It's some words.
No, and there's a really broad spectrum of threats here that this sort of encompasses. You know, we mentioned the attack on Hezbollah, and that was, you know, clearly using our attachment to technology, but with a more conventional warlike attack. And then right at the other end, you've got these sort of provocative messages on Facebook or by the phone network, as it was in this case, or WhatsApp has often been used in this sort of way. And in between these two extremes, there's a whole range of practices known as sort of grey zone warfare or sub-threshold attacks. It's even been talked about in the context of Putin and Russia saber-rattling over the potential use of US and UK missiles by Ukraine, and the suggestion that a state of war might exist between the two countries. Some people read into that it was a nuclear threat, but a lot of security analysts think actually it's much more likely that some sort of cyber attack, which may be more of the kind of disinformation that Russia has become known for, but could actually be a sort of slightly more disruptive attack on something like trying to take control of NHS computers, air traffic control, energy companies, those sorts of targets.
And so, Chandrika, it's kind of interesting that this story only really came out this week, but as Vincent said, the event happened last year, because you'd sort of hope, I mean, I know we've had the Hezbollah pages, so that's, very much focused everyone's minds, but you'd sort of hope that all governments and all institutions are very, very aware of tech threats. That should be almost their number one concern.
Yeah, because we've had, the British Library was kind of unusable for quite a few months, wasn't it? And we've had, wave upon wave of attacks on NHS records, the data is something that criminal gangs want to get hold of. But actually, we do have one success story, and there probably are others, but obviously security issues around making these stories known to the public. So we've got the Lockbit story. So what happened here was the National Crime Agency infiltrated systems belonging to Lockbit, and I'll get into who they are in a minute, and they actually flashed up a message on their website saying this has been taken over, which I feel is quite a win for a government agency. So Lockbit is meant to be a Russian organisation and a really prolific ransomware group, and they're always trying to break in stuff. Some of Lockbit's targets were the Royal Mail, NHS suppliers, and law firm Allen & Overy, and also Boeing, who've got enough problems of their own to be dealing with. And basically the UK government managed to crack into their systems and kind of get one over on them for once. So the government is kind of each government is kind of in a fight ongoing against these kind of gangs, against other organisations that are using ever-evolving technology to break into our devices.
Yeah, although that threat from Russia, Vincent, is something that I think people are probably a bit more aware of, and think about more ever since the allegations around Trump coming to power with the help of Russia, etc., and Russia's involvement in social media, and particularly in Sweden as well, because they're on Russia's doorstep. But what is the relationship between Sweden and Iran?
Well, I think where the complications have arisen really is there's a sort of long-running background about where Iran has taken Swedish hostages as pawns almost to get their own people out of jail, and it's also trying to influence mafia gangs in Sweden to do their bidding. So the tensions are rising between those two countries very much, and this is the latest, if you like, twist in this. And Iran is now seen as a very serious threat by the Swedish government and Swedish prosecutors, and the text messages are very much another sort of alarming development in the tensions rising between Iran and Sweden. But then we've also got the further complication that in sort of the geopolitics of Europe, Iran is of course backing Russia in what's going on in Ukraine. So all these conflicts, whether that's Gaza or Ukraine, are all being played out in these other ways across Europe. And I fear that that's only going to get worse. So what we're seeing happening in Sweden and that SMS hacking, there's no reason why that couldn't happen in the UK and other places. What it seems like is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard literally employ these groups of hackers almost as a commercial enterprise and say, this is what we want you to do. We want you to spread disinformation. This time it was in Sweden, but there's no reason why that couldn't be Russians doing it and employing hackers and doing it in the UK or in the US elections that are coming up or anywhere else. So it's a very pervasive and alarming, malign influence, and a great way from a criminal point of view or a terrorism point of view of getting directly into those devices that we think we all trust.
It was worth saying Iran deny the allegations, obviously.
They do.
I mean, Holden, how sophisticated is this as a threat? Because as alluded to earlier, it sounds like it's just an SMS. Was it even targeted at Muslims, or did it just go out to everybody?
In this case, it's hard to find those sorts of details, and as far as has been reported, there's no evidence that it was targeted. One case that's been studied a lot is the 2016 US election, where the Internet Research Agency, which is a Kremlin-backed group of hackers, ran quite a concerted effort to discredit Hillary Clinton, which included hacking into email accounts, publicising those emails, but also a similar sort of information or disinformation campaign to try and sow dissent. And there they really did have quite a specific level of targeting, where they were setting up pages related to Black Lives Matter and sending out messages that were targeted at African American campaigners, talking a lot about police brutality and encouraging people to protest about that, and at the same time sending messages to white supremacist groups with messages that were designed to appeal to them. And in one case, they actually managed to engineer a protest and counter-protest in the real world by telling each group that the other was going to be at a certain place at a certain time and getting those to come out onto the streets. So clearly this sort of thing, if it's done convincingly and if it's targeted well, can have significant real-world effects. But there has, contradicting that, been other bits of research which have suggested that that was a bit of an anomaly, and that usually this sort of messaging doesn't manage to change people's minds because it tends to be seen only by people who already believe the message that's being propagated, and that actually a very small number of people overall saw those Russian propagated messages during the 2016 campaign, and those divisions and the attitudes of Trump versus Hillary Clinton era were much more the result of authentically held views propagated by Americans rather than Russian-backed agents.
But Vincent, in this case, what is it that the Iranians would actually want out of sowing discontent? Because the issue in Sweden was, as I understand it, two people who themselves were Muslims, they were Iraqis, burned a Quran in protest, and under Swedish rights to free speech, that's something that was condoned. But then there was a counter-protest that Iran wanted, where people turn up outside and say, this is unacceptable, you're burning our holy book. What would be the advantage of them doing that? Rather than having a smaller incident go by, they've created a bigger incident which sows more discontent.
Well, that's right. I mean, it does seem a bit strange, but I think that once they saw those rather graphic book burnings in 2023, they just wanted revenge, effectively, which is what they were asking for in those text messages. So one element was they wanted to paint Sweden as an Islamophobic country and intolerant of their beliefs. And the other element is this idea of prisoner swaps, where there are Iranian nationals that have been arrested and are in prison, and they're using that as leverage to try and get those prisoners released.
Right, okay. The prisoner swap thing makes a bit more sense of it, because I'm trying to think, what's the advantage of making Sweden seem like a more Islamophobic country if you're worried about Muslims who are actually in the country at the time?
Well, exactly, yes. But I think the prisoner swaps is a key element to it. There was one individual in particular who was arrested at Stockholm Airport in 2019, and he was sentenced to life in prison in July 2022 for his role in mass killings in Iranian jails some time ago in the 1980s. And they were very keen to get him out. And there was a prisoner swap announced, and he was released in exchange for a European diplomat. So there's that sort of ongoing sort of under the radar diplomacy, and this is an element of increasing the leverage to sort of make those prisoner swaps work a bit better from Iran's point of view.
So we've seen exploding pages, we've seen mass SMSs. What other technology should we be wary of, Sachandrika? What's next?
Well, basically, any of our devices can be accessed because they're a two-way street, aren't they? We can receive signal and send them out. But the NSA, so the American National Security Agency, does have some tips that can help keep you safe. They seem pretty straightforward, but this is their advice on trying to safeguard your devices. So they mentioned something called spear phishing. One thing about this situation is there are lots of amazing new words. So spear phishing is when your phone is targeted to install malware. So it's basically getting a virus on your phone, which you think should happen more often, but it doesn't. I've never really had that. So their advice is to power your phone off once a week, and that really helps to stop the criminals keeping the data that's stored on your phone. So that feels like good advice. And then there's a couple of other things that's worth the listeners maybe hearing about. Update your apps. Use the official app stores only for your phone. Watch out for public Wi-Fi and avoid joining it, especially when it doesn't have a password. Use a VPN whenever you do have to join a public network. Tricky on your phone. Disable Bluetooth if you're not using it. For those of us with AirPods, that is difficult. And then make sure if you have biometrics on your phone, so face recognition and finger recognition, use that instead of a passcode. And finally, switch off location services and disable it where possible.
And try not to walk around in a constant state of crippling paranoia.
And just time travel back to 1980 and see you there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Get yourself a burner phone from Nokia. I mean, just finally on this, Holden, when it comes to Iran, I mean, they've got other things to worry about, clearly, with what's happening in Lebanon at the moment. And this is sort of what they were doing last year, as we've alluded to earlier. But they also have a new president. Do you think that will make any difference? Do you think they're still going to be continuing to pursue this sort of line of attack?
I think it's unlikely that would have too much of an impact on this sort of thing. There's, the Iranian presidency has relatively limited powers. There was hope that it may signal some sort of long-term change, but I think in terms of the sort of operational level, it's highly likely that Iran and all states, including Western states, are going to be looking at technology and looking at ways to get into the minds of their opponents, enemies, even their allies, as we've seen in the past with some of the US data collection programs. So I think governments and individuals should continue to be aware that this sort of thing might happen more.
Okay. Up next, what will Americans soon be putting up their noses in the privacy of their own homes? That's after this. Okay, Holden, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
For the vaccine of the future, just follow your nose.
Multiple companies and researchers are working on intranasal vaccines, but it is not an easy task. These vaccines use live but weakened viruses. The goal is to genetically modify the vaccine viruses to the point where they trigger the start of an infection, which the immune system will then shut down. This process teaches the body to be on guard against this pathogen in the future. But there's a sweet spot to hit with nasal vaccine.
Why isn't there a nasal vaccine for COVID-19? A 2022 video from Stat News explaining how intranasal vaccines could work. And now, Holden, we have one.
We do, not for COVID-19, but for flu. And we actually have had a flu vaccine that can be administered via the nose for some time. But the news this week is that the US government has approved one which can be used in the home. So what this means is that Americans won't have to go to a GP surgery or a chemist, but they'll be able to order this vaccine from a website run by AstraZeneca, which is the maker of this vaccine. And if they're an adult, they'll be able to spray the vaccine up their nose themselves. And for children, adults will be able to administer it to them.
And interestingly, I think I read that it's not for older people, who are the people that are targeted, by the NHS for vaccines in this country.
Yes, that's right. One reason is that for older people, the NHS and the US government both recommend a much higher dose, and that gives them slightly higher protection against severe symptoms of flu.
Right.
But for younger people, and in fact it's from the age of 2 upwards, for younger people this nasal vaccine is recommended because it has a higher chance of stopping the infection at its cause, because in a very intuitive way, the nasal vaccine actually provokes more of an immune response in the nose, which is how the flu virus gets into your body. And because children are quite prolific spreaders of flu, if you can stop them getting the infection in the first place, that gives actually a higher degree of protection to everyone else as well.
I mean, there's another reason, of course, Suchandrika, which is a lot of us just don't like needles. How are you with needles? Does this appeal to you?
I'm okay with them, and there was never any escape having a GP for a dad, so...
Just constantly stabbing you with
didn't
sharp
matter where I
objects,
hid, he knew where I lived.
Vincent, how about you? Are you needle phobic?
Hugely. I hate needles. It's one of the worst things in my life. I can't bear them. I mean, as somebody who's a bit overweight, all my friends say, you should get a Zempic and get those jabs. I'm like, I would love to do that, but I can't stand a needle. So even for good reasons, like medical health reasons, I will have the jabs, hate doing it, can't look at the needle, have to look away. If I accidentally see it, I'm in real trouble. So I'm very needle
if you
phobic.
could administer a Zempic with a nasal spray, would you do that?
I would 100% do that. It's the only reason I don't do it is because you've got to stick a needle in you. So not a big fan of them. But I am a big fan of vaccines, and I think one of the problems is that we're seeing a big drop-off in the number of people taking vaccines. Part of this is sort of spurred by some of the inaccurate disinformation that was around the COVID jabs. But I was just looking at Pulse, the medical magazine, the other day, and they're noting that particularly among children, the take-up rate on childhood vaccines has fallen again. No vaccine is meeting the 95% target for coverage, particularly important for parents who've got children they're not immunising against whooping cough and measles. These are potentially killer diseases. Some don't want the immunisation for ideological reasons. Some may have other reasons. They may be needle phobic, or their children may be. But it's a really worrying trend, because for vaccines to work, you need a critical mass to take them up. And a lot of these figures are now showing there are downward trends. And the first dose of the MMR jab has now fallen below 90% nationally for 3 years in a row. And this decline, I think, puts us at real risk of a big childhood outbreak of measles or something like that. And that's not good for anybody, really, not good for children. And it's a really worrying trend in the UK at the moment.
So do you think it could be coming to the UK, Holden, this technique?
Not in this particular case, at least in the short term. And that's, I think, for two reasons. One is that the nasal vaccine is only used among children here so far, and self-administration amongst children probably is a step too far. But I think the other reason is that the health service here is much more centralised and institutionalised than it is in the US or other countries too. And the NHS generally has been slower than other systems to move treatments out of hospitals and GPs to other providers, even to NHS chemists or walk-in centres. There's pros and cons to each approach. In the UK's COVID vaccine programme, which was sort of nationalised and centralised, that did very well at reaching vulnerable people, but it doesn't lend itself to a self-service approach. And I think it would be a big philosophical leap for UK health regulators to say people can start administering their own vaccines.
And are there any downsides to the nasal spray?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly long list of reasons that it can't be used, which are around respiratory problems. So for instance, if these are specifically guidelines for children, because influenza is only available for children in the UK at the moment. So if they're wheezy, if they've been wheezy in the past 72 hours, they can't use it. If they're using asthma reliever intakers, they can't have this nasal spray vaccine. If they needed intensive care due to an allergy to eggs, and allergies are on the rise, then they can't have it. Any condition that weakens the immune system, any condition that needs salicylate treatment, so there's contraindications or other conditions, and children who've been vaccinated shouldn't be around other people with severely compromised immune systems.
I guess there's also the risk, Vincent, he just might not do it properly. And that's the other thing, isn't it? We know this from COVID testing at home. People, they bugger it up.
Absolutely. It was quite uncomfortable, wasn't it, sticking those things up your nose and trying to get it right. So it's not as simple as it seems. One thing I would say about the Americans, though, is their drugs tend to be on the whole hugely expensive compared to what we pay here. So it'd be very interesting to see if we can get things like that licensed over here, because the easier you make it for people to do things and self-administer, the better it works. But potentially the big risk this winter, as we haven't really got there yet, is we face some kind of big flu epidemic, because as everybody knows, the NHS is at breaking point. The last thing we need is a flu epidemic. So the better we can stop that, the better it is for all of us, really.
And also, Holden, a potential exciting bit of research that you forwarded me from Nature magazine suggests that we might not need to get vaccinated against flu every year, that we might be able to get lifetime immunity one day soon.
Yes, that's the hope. And there's been a huge amount of progress on multiple fronts with vaccines since the pandemic, the research into mRNA vaccines in particular. And there's, at various stages of research and development, we now have vaccines in the pipeline for bird flu, SARS, MERS, C. difficile, herpes, HIV, malaria, norovirus, TB, and earlier stages of research for vaccines that will prevent some types of cancer. But yeah, as you said, the current flu vaccines have to be updated each year. They target particular strains. The virus is always evolving. Now there's hope that by targeting the sort of core of the virus instead of the protein spikes, the sort of periphery of it, it will be possible to create a vaccine that targets all variants of flu and in new, currently unknown variants of flu that might crop up in the future. And that would A, mean it was much more effective, but B, as you say, mean that you wouldn't have to go through that process every year. One other thing I'd just add on the sort of vaccine hesitancy front, I saw quite a few medics suggesting that even though that feels like a very sort of deep-seated problem to tackle, something like a nasal vaccine or an oral vaccine or a skin patch could have a significant effect in reducing that, just because psychologically it's sort of harder to present a skin patch or an oral drug or a nasal spray as being a kind of instrument of state control than it is an injection. There's just something about a needle that sort of lends itself to conspiracy theories. And so, you're not going to get to everybody with that, but if you could reduce vaccine hesitancy, then that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, unless Bill Gates says anything about it, and then there is food for conspiracy theorists, isn't there? We're going to be talking about Elon Musk again, can you believe? He just keeps doing newsworthy stuff. I'd rather he didn't keep coming up, but he does. That's after this. So Chandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is Elon just giving Twitter over to the trolls?
Elon, why are you removing the block button? I've blocked hundreds of people for my own safety. Stalkers, trolls, people who are just genuinely trying to ruin my life. Like, if I can't block people, I'm going to have to deactivate my account. Like, I love this app, but I just won't feel safe anymore. But you're ruining this platform and you don't even care. Please, don't do this.
Astrid Wet, who has 260,000 followers on X, responding to what news, Sir Chandrika?
X, formerly known as Twitter, is getting rid of the block feature. Elon Musk, who is apparently in charge of this platform, he has been kind of warning he's going to do this for quite a long time, but it does feel like now he's actually going to do it. There was a tweet from a web developer from X who first reports the news. So this is Nima Odri, who said, the block function is going to go, and in the very official ways that he does like to report his news, Elon just messaged replied to this person and was like, yeah, it's going to happen. So we are losing the block function, which, as we heard from the clip, is going to make a lot of users on Twitter or X have a much worse experience of the platform.
Okay, so for those of us who actually don't use X that are listening, can you give us a 101? What is the block button and why does it matter?
The block button, so if I was to block Ollie, would I ever? Are you still on Twitter? I don't know. I follow your every move.
I try.
So if I was to block Ollie, that would mean that we can't communicate. And also, if you looked over at my account, you wouldn't be able to see any of my posts. Mm-hmm. And so by taking this block away, it means you can still block someone from sending you a direct message. So those private messages will still be safe. But it means the person you've blocked, while they can't sort of communicate with you, so they can't retweet you or at you or anything like that, which is what it's like now, they can look at your content. And it means they can use your content for their own ends. If necessary, they can use a tweet. Okay,
so explain that, because a lot of people, particularly female users, have been saying this means I'm going to get harassed. But if you can't DM someone and you can't @reply them and you can't retweet them or whatever they call it now, repost, how would you be harassing someone? What kind of method would you be using just because you can access their public feed?
I'm not sure there's a particular term for doing this, but what it can do is cause a pylon. So what you can do is take a screenshot of someone's tweet. I do this when I don't want to give someone more engagement, but I do want to share the tweet. And then you can use that as a picture in your tweet and say, for instance, why is this woman so upset with Elon Musk? She is terrible, or whatever, terms trolls are using now. And so that's where you can then get other people who are following you and who are not blocked by that initial person, they can harass them.
I suppose the question then is whether it is X's role to stop that kind of harassment, Vincent. If it isn't direct harassment, if it is about saying we're a public square, that's what Elon Musk is fond of saying, isn't it? We're a public square, it's all about free speech, you can say whatever you like. Those are the principles that I run this app on. Then I suppose it is kind of consistent to say you can't select who gets to look at what you write. That's not in the spirit of what we're doing here.
True, but I think it's about where you set the bar, and I think the view about Elon Musk is he's got the bar in the wrong place, and he should, and all platforms should be taking a greater role in preventing harassment and abuse, whether that's by screenshotting an image and then causing a pylon or any other method. And I think he's got a lot of these things in the wrong place and uses the veil, if you like, of free speech as an excuse to allow a lot of pretty abhorrent behaviour to carry on. And that's what's happening at the moment. Some of the abuse on Twitter has caused an awful lot of people to say they're not going to continue using the platform. And the block button and muting and things like that are a very important part of controlling or trying to control those who would seek to troll you or abuse you.
And it goes further than that, doesn't it, Holden? It's actually an important regulatory part of being part of the App Store and the Google Play Store.
Yeah, that's right. And there is some question about whether X will still be available to users of Android or Apple devices if he goes ahead with this, because it is one of the rules that if you are distributing a social networking platform, then you have to have some method of blocking people. I would say, though, that blocking on X or Twitter has always been quite a weak solution, because there was nothing to stop serious stalkers or trolls creating another account and popping up over and over again,
or just opening your browser in incognito mode. I've seen people writing
exactly.
Just do that if you want to see someone.
If you didn't want to go to that much effort, you could just log out, in fact, and you could then see a person's profile and message. And in fact, that's something that Elon Musk has changed slightly for the better, although possibly not with the idea of kind of people's welfare in mind, but more to try and increase people creating accounts, in that he's stopped you seeing more than a few posts on anybody's profile page unless you do log in. But yes, you could still just create multiple accounts. I suppose this, in some ways, if this does have a significant effect, then it would prove that most of the abuse and trolling and kind of online stalking you see is actually quite a sort of low threshold behavior. Like, people just aren't willing to go to the effort of creating an extra account. It is something that people do quite casually, and that suggests that it's something that could maybe be prevented at source slightly more easily if it was something that Twitter and other social media platforms actively wanted to do. But I think the suspicion is always that it's just not in their business interest, and hasn't been, but Elon Musk has taken that to new levels.
I mean, where do you put this in the Elon Musk narrative, Sachandrika, in terms of since he took over Twitter? He now charges for a blue check mark. He makes sure that he is visible on your timeline, regardless of whether or not you choose to engage with him or not. What is the effect that these changes are having?
Some really awful things have been going on. So a couple of statistics here which are just so grim. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate and the Anti-Defamation League have both found that racist slurs have increased nearly 3 times since October 2022, and the Institute of Strategic Dialogue reports that anti-Semitic posts have doubled. That is in just the last couple of years. So that is really grim, and also shows that there are no consequences for this kind of hate speech as well, that actually Elon Musk's Twitter is not doing anything about that kind of thing. And then also you mentioned that Elon is very present in all our feeds. He's like, was it Tom from MySpace, but like horrified, but like deeply
like a Bond villain.
He's like
Tom
an
from
Emerald
MySpace,
Mine Ed. He's horrifying. And I've got a feeling that this feels a little bit out there, but I've got a feeling that the timing is to do with Trump and the election. Now, if you make this change now, Trump was famously thrown off Twitter in the Jack Dorsey era, in the kind of liberal era, which is long gone now. It's when we all joined. And things have changed, and now there's an election coming up, and things aren't looking good. So it seems like a lot of people have got Trump blocked, and now we can see his content, and now it's going to change his visibility on the platform. It's going to change what he can do on that platform. And to me, it just seems like maybe it's visibility for the right-wingosphere that is going to improve, and that is what Elon is doing right now.
Well, if you believe, Vincent, that seeing more from Donald Trump makes you more likely to vote for him, I mean, there's an argument that actually him having been over on Truth Social for the last couple of years, mostly, I know he's back on X technically now, has actually had the effect of hiding some of the wild and wacky stuff from the general public.
Well, it's impossible to know, isn't it? Because you would think any right-thinking person would see that the more they see of Trump, that they won't vote for him. But we all tend to, depending on our various platforms that we move on, tend to live in a sort of echo chamber. And you never know what happens. I mean, I've thought in past elections, because of what I was seeing on Twitter, the results were going to be completely different from what they were. And that's more a reflection of the people I was following than what was actually really happening. I think one of the key things about where we go with this is, I was talking to a lot of politicians recently. I was up at the Labour conference last week, and they're all telling me how they hate Twitter and they're all moving to Blue Sky or Threads. Well, that's fine, but Twitter's got 370 million users and Blue Sky's got about 10 million, so it's 37 times bigger. If you want to get your message across, however unpleasant that marketplace is, that forum is, it's massive. And if you're in the business of spreading news or keeping abreast of the news, you probably have to stay on X, however unpopular it is. Yet there is this move, because bear in mind many politicians were annoyed with Musk for his comments during the riots over here in the UK and some of the things he said. So there's a move among the left and a lot of Labour MPs in particular to get off X and to try and encourage other people, a kind of Pied Piper move, to go onto Blue Sky. But I've been asking friends about Blue Sky. Most people haven't heard of it. So what's the point of going on to a new, different platform if people don't know it exists?
Yeah, there's also just that slightly self-aggrandizing thing, Sachandrika, of being like, I'm off. You know, telling everyone on X like they care where you're going, you know, like you were the reason they were there, which I think people just etiquette-wise feel a bit nervous about, even if actually they've stopped looking at X because it's so incredibly depressing.
Yeah, there's so many levels to this, isn't there, of like, how do you leave Twitter if you're going to leave it? What do you do? For some people, it is really important. They tell their fan base or their followers that you can find me over on Instagram or another platform. For other people like myself, I'm staying until it burns. I want to see what happens. I want to see how this ends. I think, as Vincent says, it's such a big platform still that it will take a long time for it to kind of lose everyone. But at the same time, I think the bad publicity around this move is going to get a load of people to leave.
I mean, out of all of us, Holden, you are the one who's most responsible for the thing that Vincent was talking about there, which is trying to spread news via the week's websites. But actually, X is making that increasingly harder, isn't it? That it's harder to spread news. It's easier to spread sensationalism. So does it matter?
It was always the case that Twitter in the old days was responsible for less click-throughs to The Week or other publications I've worked for than something like Facebook. You could get a lot of noise, you could get a lot of reaction, but people wouldn't actually read the article. You would often get more comments on the platform, praising, criticising the article than you would see click-throughs from Twitter to the website. So you could know with some certainty that people were arguing about an article that they hadn't read. The Week still posts links on X. It feels like we have a duty to put stories out there and maintain some sort of presence, but it's not a priority for us in the way that it might once have been. I was a very early user of Twitter. I enjoyed it a lot at one point, found it fun, useful, informative, and especially when I worked at Wired, it just felt like a natural fit, and sort of probably guilty of some techno-utopian feelings about it. But I look back and my last tweet was on 3rd of April 2020, and I think it's not a coincidence that was the beginning of the pandemic, and that was the time where it felt, during Brexit, Twitter had been quite an unpleasant place to be, but it felt like the claim and counterclaim and the disinformation was sort of part of the story and helped in understanding what was happening. And it really was a good way of getting a wide range of views. But during the pandemic, that became actively harmful and sort of detrimental to you. You understood less about what was happening if you used Twitter as your source. And I think increasingly that sort of spread to other areas of politics. So I mean, I have a look at certain users and I kind of dip into them as sources, but as a sort of general feed, I do feel it's past the point where it brings more benefit than cost.
And to Sachandrika's thought, Vincent, about the US elections and how this may be a play to try and sway that, we all know, don't we, that it's only tens of thousands of people in certain swing states that are going to determine who's going to win the presidential election, really, who still haven't made up their mind. Are they going to be swayed by this? They're not even on X, are they?
Exactly, I doubt it. I mean, it is those crucial handful of voters in half a dozen swing states that everybody's fighting over, and all the rest really is noise. I mean, most people I speak to now try and get their message across increasingly on LinkedIn, or many of my friends are now on Instagram. But I think it was Mary Beard who said, you really should want to stay and fight on Twitter, because otherwise you're just giving up the ground to the idiots and the trolls and the extremists. So I think I'm going to try and stay there and dip in occasionally, but it has become increasingly unpleasant, and we do need those things like the block feature, because there are some people that there's only one language they understand, and that's the block button, isn't it?
Okay, well, I'm pressing that button right now because we have reached the end of this edition of the show. My thanks to Vincent, Sachandrika and Holden. You can follow this show for free, and you can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped and tap follow wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine. What a respite from social media that is, by getting a trial subscription at theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Claire Williamson at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.